Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Reaction to today's economic data, the inflation gauge the Fed looks at in terms of the PCE price index, but also, of course, that GDP report that was even weaker than expected thanks to a surge in imports, 0.3% decline in the first quarter. But to hear President Trump describe it, he says that's just the hangover or the overhang from President Joe Biden. He actually said at the beginning of his cabinet meeting that's still ongoing at the White House, Joe, that he deserves a pass when it comes to this data.
Overhang, a technical term for economists, I think, right? We will go back into that cabinet meeting if the president starts to take some questions. Now, enter Peter Navarro, of course, economic advisor and tariff evangelist, speaking to reporters in the White House driveway this morning. This was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. And that's where we have to start with Michael McKee, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent. He's with us in New York as we wait to hear from President Trump. Michael, take us to school here. Peter Navarro talked about an extraordinary surge of imports, the world trying to sell to the U.S. Does that front running of imports guarantee a downturn in the second half of the year? Is there a silver lining here or not?
I wouldn't say there's a silver lining. We don't have any guarantees at all. Matt Miller, our morning anchor here, insulted me today by saying I was sounding like Peter Navarro because I said if I were the president, I would try to turn the attention away from the negative 0.3 headline GDP number and turn it towards the 2.3% gain in real final private sales to domestic buyers, because what you have there is a sign of what we were really spending, businesses and people, consumers. And that's not a terrible number, but it too, like everything else, was influenced by tariffs. We thought we might get through this quarter without a big tariff data impact, but this whole GDP number is shot through with tariff implications. And so much of it is the effort by companies, especially to get ahead of tariffs and order things early. We saw this huge jump in imports that probably, I think they said the biggest ever. And then that fed into inventories, and the business spending was up 9.8%, but a lot of that was because they were ordering all this stuff. So it's really hard to say that this is a great report or the best one you've ever seen, but there are political ways maybe to spin it a little better.
Well, and when we're considering the data we still have yet to get this week, Mike, with a payrolls report coming up on Friday for the month of April, and I wonder whether or not we're still counting April as being Biden's economy or Trump's economy now that he's in his second 100 days in office as we speak. How will all of that data collectively factor into a Federal Reserve decision that's coming next week?
It won't. There's no... Today, basically, because the GDP numbers showed a contraction in growth overall and a rise in the quarterly PCE numbers, somebody said this morning, well, this makes the Fed's job harder. And I said, no, it makes it easier because it just reinforces the idea that they don't want to do anything right now. You've got contradictory numbers or contradictory directions on the Fed's two mandates in that GDP report. And we don't know what's going to go on from here because remember, this quarter ended in March. And in March, we had the aluminum and steel tariffs, but little else other than the standard Chinese stuff. And so we don't know what the impact is going to be of all the tariffs that got put on, got taken off, et cetera, during the month of April. It certainly has affected consumers' thinking, but has it affected their actions? And that's the question ahead. So we're going to have to be watching all this data very carefully, and the Fed's just going to sit back and do that. You mentioned the jobs report. Tomorrow, we get the ISM manufacturing report. And while that is considered soft data, it could be very important to the markets because if we see the same kind of nationwide response that we've seen in some of the regional numbers, we're going to see a big drop in manufacturing activity, new orders, that sort of thing. And that's also not going to play well with Wall Street.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. Thank you so much, breaking down the data we have in hand and the data still to come. Thank you very much indeed. As we're still keeping an eye on the cabinet room at the White House, we're hearing right now from the Interior Secretary Doug Burgum. The only remaining cabinet secretary left to speak as they go all the way around the table is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And again, when it gets back to President Trump, if he decides to take questions from reporters, we will be bringing that to you. But first, we want to get more insight on where the economy is right now and whether or not the president deserves credit or blame for that, and turn to Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's president of the American Action Forum and former director of the Congressional Budget Office. There's a lot Congress-wise we want to talk to you about, Douglas, but if we could first begin with the deterioration we've seen in GDP, the suggestion from the president that it's Joe Biden who shoulders the blame for this. Does that excuse work today? And if it does, how much longer will it?
Well, if it works today, it's not going to work beginning tomorrow. I'd say this is really the end of the period when you could point backwards on the data. The president can't be responsible for the January data, but the quarter as a whole, it really is in the Trump administration. It's a noticeable weakening in the economy. I think if you toss out all the trade-related factors that Mike McKee went through, you've got an underlying growth rate of something like 1.5, down from 2.5 in the fourth quarter, 2.4. That's troubling because it's when we turn the corner into April that we see the impact of Liberation Day and the array of tariffs that went on and off. We'll get our first impact read on that in the official data on Friday, but we saw the ADP employment report today, and that came in very soft, 62,000 jobs, some weakness in places you wouldn't expect, education and health. So I think Friday's jobs report is going to be a very important read on the economy.
It'll tell us a lot more as we hear further references to the R word here and some suggesting we may already be in a recession. Douglas, it's great to have you back. We heard from Peter Navarro this morning, as you might have heard me mention. This was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. You feel that way too?
Well, every now and then I yell at the TV. No, I don't feel that way at all. This was a bad report. I don't think there's any way you can sugarcoat it. Among the things that were really troubling was the very soft household spending, particularly on goods, durable goods. You would have thought that people, and we heard a lot of anecdotes about this, you would have thought that people would be buying ahead of the tariffs to get those things in their houses before they hit. That's a really weak number. And so I think if you look at that and the fact that outside of what's clearly a tariff-related surge in equipment investment, the core of the economy really didn't look good in the first quarter. And as Mike McKee mentioned, the PCE core price index was up to 3.5%. That's a bad combination. Rising inflation, softening economy. Nobody should think this is a good print.
Well, so then it becomes a question of any kind of correction or what could pull us out from the downward trajectory, Douglas. And the White House would argue, as we heard evidenced in the cabinet meeting earlier, that the tax cuts coming down the pike, the renewal of the 2017 cuts, the others that Trump would like to implement, are going to be somewhat of a solve here. And I wonder, assuming that the president can get everything he wants on tax policy, which still remains a question as Congress works on that, to what extent you do expect it'll be some kind of offsetting factor?
Well, let's think about what's in the bill. I mean, number one, it's an extension of current tax law. I don't think anyone expects the sunset, so we're not going to get any juice out of that. That's just more of the same. There are the business expenses on R&D and equipment investment, interest deductibility. Those are modestly positive, but I don't think they're earth-shaking. And then there are the array of campaign promises: no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, SALT cap, things that the president wants to have at least some modest bow toward to fulfill his campaign promises. Those aren't earth changers either. So, from an economic point of view, the tax bill is not a big boost to growth. I mean, it's something we got in 2017. It's already in the economy. So I think the real issue here is, does the president come to reality on what he's done with the tariff policy? If you think having a sunset and a $425 billion tax increase next year is a bad idea, that's what he did on Liberation Day. And so I think some rethinking of the burden that he has placed on American businesses and consumers is really in order. And it's hitting the small businesses the hardest. They're the ones who are cash constrained. They're the ones who are going to pull back on their CapEx the quickest. And I'm concerned about that outlook.
Yeah, interesting. We could talk about the baseline until we're blue in the face here, Douglas, but are we talking about likely an enormous deficit spend here? We're looking at the potential for Medicaid cuts one day, and Donald Trump last night says, and by the way, he's been consistent on don't touch Medicaid.
Yeah.
It's been a different conversation on the Hill. Last night he said Republicans will increase Medicaid spending. How are we going to pay for that?
I don't think there's a plan to pay for it. They don't plan to pay for defense spending increases. They don't plan to pay for border spending increases. So I think the best case scenario one could map out would be one where we didn't make the current already bad fiscal outlook worse, but most likely it will be worse. Maybe not dramatically worse, but certainly worse than they inherited. And that means that beginning next year, which is an election year, not much will happen. We have to at some point get serious about the deficit. And there's no seriousness right now, and I don't think anything in this bill is going to address it at all.
Well, and when we consider the deficit, that's why we keep having to borrow and borrow and borrow, and the Treasury's debt ceiling of how much it can issue goes higher and higher. We heard from the Treasury Secretary that IRS revenue has been up, Douglas, as we await an update from the Treasury on when exactly the X date will be. When are you anticipating it, and how important will that be to the movement of legislation in Congress if it's earlier in the summer than is previously or is currently anticipated?
We've mentioned this before when I was on, and I'm quite worried about the fact that they're counting on the reconciliation bill to raise the debt limit. There's no guarantee those timetables line up. It's going to be hard to get to yes in the House, hard to get to yes in the Senate, and even harder to get the two houses to agree on a single piece of legislation. That might not happen before an August X date, in which case they'll have to break out and do the debt limit by itself. We saw the bond market react in the week after Liberation Day. We saw the long end of the yield curve go up, and this is not the time to have some sort of misstep in raising the debt limit. They need to do it in a timely fashion, not scare international capital markets, secure the funding future of the Treasury, and that may not be able to happen on the timetable of reconciliation. So there should be a plan B out there somewhere.
Plan B out there. You must get that tinge. Your antennas go up when the X date is approaching here, Douglas. If that has to be handled separately and Republicans make a deal with Democrats, putting your politics hat on for a moment, does that change the nuances of the reconciliation debate, or are these going to be two completely separate exercises? One will involve Democrats, the other will not.
If they have to do the debt limit, they will need Democrats in both the House and the Senate, and that will be expensive. Democrats will want some things that Republicans aren't planning to do in reconciliation. They're going to want an extension of the health insurance tax credits. They're going to want a bigger child credit. They're going to want a lot. And so what loses is the fiscal outlook. You get to raise the debt limit and solve the immediate problem, but you make the longer-term problem harder. And I don't know what that does in reconciliation. It may empower them to say, okay, well, we might as well just blow it all out this year. We already spent a lot of money, which is the wrong reaction to have, but we've seen it before. So I think that dynamic's actually a very dangerous one from a fiscal policy point of view.
Well, and when we consider the shape of all of this policy, what role realistically, Douglas, is the parliamentarian going to play? And is there anything you're skeptical about actually getting through that review, knowing that for Republicans to be able to pull this off, they have to use this reconciliation process, and John Thune wants to stick to, or at least was indicating previously, wants to stick to whatever the parliamentarian rules.
Right. Yes, he did say that, and I think that's the right call. It really limits the scope. I mean, we've heard things like putting all of the competition policy in the Department of Justice and getting rid of the FTC. You can't do that in reconciliation. There's a lot of regulatory reform they'd like to do. It seems unlikely to make it through in regulation. Energy policy, you can do clean energy tax credits in or out, but you can't really do big policy making. So I think it would narrow the scope of that one big beautiful bill considerably. And if they want to make those policies real, they're going to have to do some more legislating after the reconciliation bill.
Where are you on the timelines here, Douglas? The Speaker still seems to think Memorial Day is realistic. Scott Bessent is pointing us to the 4th of July. Are either reasonable?
I've been thinking Thanksgiving all along, so I'm skeptical. I mean, my observation is that the House can be done by July 4th and the Senate can be done by July 4th, but I don't think they can agree by July 4th. They have yet to settle any differences. Wow. As you mentioned at the outset, they haven't even figured out which baseline to use. We got a current policy baseline in the Senate, current law baseline in the House. They were discussing that in December. At some point, someone has to force decisions to be made. That should be the president, in my view, but they haven't. And so they've let this process drift along on two separate tracks for all practical purposes.
Well, and when we consider practicality here, Douglas, we heard the president last night at his rally in Michigan talking about Republicans in Congress, actually, that may need to be voted out because of the way in which they sometimes act against the rest of the party. I think we know the types he's referring to. I'm not sure if Tom Massey and Chip Roy's ears perked up at that. But I do wonder what you expect to see from some of these hardline conservatives who want deep spending cuts, who want to see these offsets and may not be able to see them in the kind of size and scale realistically that they'd hope.
A reconciliation bill is an act of disappointment for everybody. It's not going to have anyone's desired mix. You're always compromising. You're always trying to fit it into the box that you've created from the budgetary point of view. And the reality is failure is not an option. So in the end, after all of the posturing and the speeches, which will take us to Thanksgiving, in my view, they're going to, lock arms and vote yes. And I think that's the outcome that everyone should expect.
Mm-hmm. Spending time with Douglas Holtz-Eakin of the American Action Forum as we also keep an eye on the White House here. President Trump is holding an extended cabinet meeting here, opening up his next 100 days at the White House, and they've been going around the room. If he takes some questions from reporters, we'll put an ear on what he's saying. Douglas, the next 100 days will be occupied more by Trump tax cuts or tariff talk, because I do feel like we're getting a bit of a transition here in the language that we're hearing from the president.
Well, I think that he's going to try to point to the tax bill as the sort of economic rescue plan. Yeah. This week report. I just don't think the substance is as outstanding as the rhetoric is. I mean, to not do it is a disaster. So let's be clear, they have to do the extension, but it's not going to do much beyond, as I said, current policy, so it's not going to do much for the economy. So I think the right thing is to, get it done in as quick a fashion as possible, and that would require, I think, a little more leadership out of the White House. Also, feature the deregulation, which all the pieces are in place to do a lot of deregulation as he did in his first time in office, and so I would feature that, and I would negotiate however many faux trade deals you need to get rid of the reciprocal tariffs. That's just too much and dangerous. And then start thinking hard about what to do with the 10% universal tariff. That to me is the one he has a hard time walking away from. It's his idea. Yeah. He's not going to admit he made a mistake. There's no one to negotiate with. And so, there may be a need for Congress to rescue him from himself and have them take away the authority to do that. I just think if the economy really weakens in the second quarter, you're going to see Congress start to think real hard about doing that.
All right. Douglas, it's always great to spend some time with you. Douglas Holtz-Eakin with his view from the American Action Forum. He's the former director of the CBO and knows what he speaks.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We're experiencing a busy day here in Washington, having just wrapped a cabinet meeting at the White House that lasted roughly 2 hours, with more expected, as President Trump will be making remarks on investing in America later this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern time. What we don't know whether or not will be happening this afternoon, though, is a signing of the minerals deal that has been in the works for months now, negotiating between the U.S. and Ukraine. We just heard from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, in that cabinet meeting, suggesting that on the U.S. side, they'd be ready to sign as soon as this afternoon, that the U.S. has made no changes, but that Ukraine, Joe, decided to make some last-minute tweaks as of last night.
Yeah, this is feeling a bit familiar. We all remember when Scott Bessent traveled all the way to Kyiv to sign this same deal, and he came home empty-handed. that set us up for the meltdown in the Oval Office in a meeting with President Zelensky that did not go well. So we thought we were coming back around on this, and it may not be about to happen. Dan Flatley is with us right now at the table, Bloomberg's Treasury reporter, who spent a lot of time in the national security space. Dan, we saw the convergence of these two in the cabinet meeting with regard to the minerals deal, which was said to potentially unlock a peace deal in Ukraine. This is feeling familiar. Will this ever be signed?
Yeah, Joe, it's a great question, and what a saga this has been.
Yeah.
But, I think just to take one step back, this deal is very important for Ukraine. This basically, the deal itself, we could talk about the details. We're still getting some reporting on that. But essentially what this is a guarantee, as far as the Trump administration is concerned, that the U.S. will continue to remain involved in Ukraine, will help Ukraine achieve some sort of equitable peace deal with Russia, if that's even possible at this point. But this deal is key. And the stakes are very high for Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with this deal, because you mentioned his trip to Kyiv earlier this year. That was a pivotal moment for him as the Treasury Secretary. It was something that was a little bit different outside of the normal role of a Treasury Secretary, trying to execute this deal that has huge national security implications. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen at that table with Zelensky. And so here we are today, and it has to happen. It has to happen. Both parties are interested in this deal happening. The Ukrainians are interested in it for all the reasons we just talked about. The U.S. is interested in it, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is interested in it because he's put a lot on the line for this personally. So I think that they will get to sign it at the end of the day. But from all we understand from our reporting, it's looking a little dicey at the moment.
Well, and if Ukraine is interested, if this is actually vital to their interests to sign this deal, they don't seem overly eager to rush to the table to actually use the pen. Dan, what is the holdup for Ukraine? Do we have an understanding of what changes it is they're seeking?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple of things going on here. Part of it is a clash of negotiating styles. The U.S. has really come on strong with this deal. And part of that is political, and it has to do with, the support for Ukraine among Trump's base and how all that's playing out. And the Ukrainians have a vested interest in this. The stakes are very high for them, maybe higher than for anyone else, really, in getting this done. And so they're pushing. They want to get this done, but I think they have some concerns about some of the technical details. And this is a big deal for them, and it's something that Zelensky and his advisors have to sell back home. So they don't want to appear to be giving away their own natural resources, their own sovereign wealth, their own prerogatives to a foreign country, no matter how great an ally it might be or how powerful it is or whatever. So I think that there's a little bit of his negotiating styles. Some of it is just the stakes are so high. But I think the fact that we're here today talking about this is, I don't think anybody would have predicted we would be here a month and a half ago or whenever the Oval Office blow up was. So.
Well, that's a very good point. That also speaks to this idea that even if getting this agreement done is hard, there's also the wider peace agreement the U.S. still wants to see between between Russia and Ukraine, and that is a whole other can of worms we'll have to get into another time. Dan Flatley, who covers the Treasury for us here at Bloomberg, thank you so much for your reporting. As we mentioned, we heard from the Treasury Secretary in the cabinet meeting earlier today, but heard much more from the president himself, Donald Trump, especially in the aftermath of today's weak GDP reading, a decline of 0.3%, thanks in part to a surge in imports as companies tried to front run the tariffs. And he says it's not him to blame. It's his predecessor, Joe Biden.
That's right. Biden data, Biden markets as well. And the president was actually asked about the stock market today, and he's been kind of changing his thought on this, suggesting he's more concerned about Main Street than Wall Street. It's a very different look than we had in the first Trump administration. He was also asked about empty shelves, Kailey. Really interesting moment. You're going to hear this played back. This is the way this goes. And that's sometimes why a 2-hour freewheeling ad-libbed interaction with the media can come with some risk. He said maybe the children will have 20 dolls instead of 30 dolls. They have ships loaded up with stuff, much of it we don't need. Put a pin in that for now.
Yeah, as we consider what other shelves other than toys may find themselves emptied if indeed we still have effectively a cutoff of trade between the U.S. and China. So we want to get into all of this now and turn to Betsy Stevenson. She's the professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan, also a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors during the Obama administration, former chief economist at the Department of Labor as well. Betsy, if we could begin first with the president's characterization today of this data, which is indeed backward looking at the first quarter, is more reflective of Joe Biden's presidency than his, even suggesting that the next quarter may be more reflective of Biden than Trump as well. Is there any way in which that is factually accurate?
No. I mean, what's ridiculous is President Trump tried to take credit for the economy around the time he was elected, that the economy was improving because people are anticipating him. And now he's saying that now that he's actually been president, that it's Biden. Look, we all know what's going on in this data. There's just been a lot of people are just not sure what President Trump's going to do. So let's put aside whether tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea. Nobody actually even really knows what's going to happen. And that is meant that, there's just been a huge run up in inventories, because if you're not sure what's going to happen, one way to get around that is to just make your purchases now, stock up inventories, and then at least you can give yourself some certainty about what your business will look like for the next 3 or 4 months. And so we saw a lot of businesses really go down that path in this quarter, which actually makes this data particularly hard to interpret in terms of where we'll be next quarter. But one thing we can know for sure is this is President Trump's economy.
Well, you probably heard us discussing, Betsy, and maybe you heard Peter Navarro or President Trump talking about the benefits of an import surge. Peter Navarro called it extraordinary and said this was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. What will be the fallout of that extraordinary import surge later in the year?
I don't actually know what they mean by that. It seems kind of ironic to me, because I thought the whole idea was to get us to reduce our imports. And there's so much anxiety that we might have to reduce imports that it caused us all to increase our imports. So it will be pretty funny if at the end of 2025, it turns out we've imported more things under President Trump's first year than we had under President Biden's last year. But aside from that, I think there's a lot of confusion when people look at the GDP numbers, because they say, well, the problem is negative because of, we subtract the imports. But remember, we're also adding the imports. So the reason we're subtracting them is we add up all the money that companies spend, and that includes the money they're spending on imports. But because we're not making those in the United States, this is a fair complaint that I think President Trump would agree with. We don't want to count those as part of our economy, because we only want to count the stuff that we're making, we're producing, our goods and services. So we subtract from their spending what they spent on imports. Now, if you want to get a little wonky, it's quite possible that there are some measurement issues, which means we're better at counting the imports that we're subtracting off than counting up all the purchases. And so when we get a revision, it might not be quite as negative, because we might be adding more in on the purchases side than we're subtracting off on the import side. But I think some of this is also what companies are doing is they're prioritizing their spending on imports, which means not spending on stuff we're producing domestically. So there is a trade-off, every dollar you spend on something is a dollar you're not spending on something else. And if you're terrified that imports aren't going to be available to you, so you're spending all your money on that, what aren't you buying?
Well, yeah. Would that include, say, adding salaries, hiring people, Betsy? How quickly could this bleed into the labor market as we look ahead to a jobs report on Friday?
Absolutely, right? If you're out there buying equipment because you're thinking, if I don't get ahead on this equipment, that's going to be a priority to you over, say, replacing a worker who's left, or making sure you keep a worker by giving them a raise. So you can absolutely think that this has a direct impact on the domestic workforce. Look, the thing we don't know is we don't know what's going to happen with tariffs. So we don't know what these businesses are going to do in the second quarter. Are they going to keep trying? They're sort of, I think we're done trying to accumulate imports, internationally now, right? So now we got to live off our inventories. How quickly do we spend them down? When do they get to go back to importing things at an affordable price? And that'll affect what ends up happening to workers and whether they need to let people go. I think a lot of companies struggled to hire coming out of the pandemic. So we're going to see companies being quite slow to let people go, but they will also be slow to fill empty slots. So that's the path we're currently on. And the question will be whether they get desperate enough that they have to let people go. I'm going to tell you that the warning that President Trump is giving us that we're going to have fewer stuff on our shelves, that's not a good one.
It's not a good one, but it is one that we're going to remember, Betsy. It's great to have you back. Betsy Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.